Greetings everyone, and welcome to the Raven's Nest. In this episode, we will begin opening the door on what really lies at the core of today's geopolitics: peace in the Middle East and the rebuilding of the Temple of Israel. Anyone who casually follows geopolitics understands that the bulwark issue that has prevented lasting peace in the Middle East is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Since Israel's inception as a recognized sovereign state in 1948, radical Arab elements have sought to destroy that state and wipe Israel from the face of the earth. These radical Arab elements have not made their primary mission of destroying Israel a secret. Quite the contrary, they have been open and honest about it from the very beginning. One of the earliest Arab Islamic groups to form in opposition to the State of Israel, and more specifically Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, was the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO. Formed in 1964 during the Arab League Summit in Cairo, Egypt, the PLO's stated goal at the time was the liberation of Palestine through armed struggle and the destruction of Zionism. Like many of the Arab Islamic groups that have risen to power and prominence over the years, the PLO, early in its development as an organization, splintered into factions over various political and religious differences concerning the organization's goals. Of the many different factions, there were four that rose to become the most notable in history. Of those four factions, one was known as the Fatah. By 1967, the leadership of the PLO had adopted a new goal concerning the liberation of the Palestinian peoples. The PLO, from its inception, stated that the liberation of Palestine could only come about through armed struggle. But now, the leadership was claiming that liberation could only occur with the total destruction of Israel. This new goal caused further divisions among the many different political and religious factions that comprised the much larger PLO. This opened the door to a power struggle at the highest leadership levels of the PLO, and through that door stepped one Yasser Arafat, leader of the Fatah faction, who promptly and firmly took control of the organization. Under the leadership of Arafat, the PLO hit the national stage when the United Nations recognized the PLO as the official representative of the Palestinian people. However, the terrorist tactics employed by the PLO against Israel had become so successful in disrupting Israel's security that Israel in 1982 launched the first Lebanon War, in which they quickly moved into Beirut and drove the PLO out. This move by Israel eventually led to Arafat and the PLO in 1988 to concede to Israel's right to exist and an agreement to abandon the use of terrorist violence against Israel. This capitulation by Arafat led to the basic situation on the ground in the West Bank and Gaza Strip that exists today. Meaning, today, under the organized leadership of what is now simply referred to as the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian people in the occupied territories have limited self-rule, an established education system, a religious authority, and some basic civil institutions. They are not, however, an internationally recognized or functioning state. Not all of the factions that comprised the PLO during the 1970s, 80s, and 90s went along with Arafat's diplomatic solutions to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and began to break off on their own. As was at that time, so it is today that many young Palestinians, weary of fighting and dying without any real victory, i.e., a state of their own, have broken away from the Palestinian Authority and joined much more radical groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. Groups that still believe the only path to Palestinian liberation is through the total destruction of Israel. It should be noted that the liberation of Palestine is not the only goal of the larger Middle Eastern Arab Islamic coalition of states. Of equal importance is the eradication of the Great Satan. In other words, the United States and its Western allies. In spite of any noble intentions the United States might have at present, or has ever had regarding the Middle East, U.S. foreign policy concerning the region since the end of World War II has been nothing less than one unmitigated disaster after another. Just one example of this, and something that most Americans today who are under the age of 45 likely don't understand, is that the modern-day situation in the country of Iran is the direct result of U.S. foreign policy blunders dating back to the 1950s. The actions of our very own CIA can be directly linked to the Iranian People's Revolution, the capture of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, and a hostage crisis where 52 American citizens were held for over a year. That revolution brought the mullahs to power in Iran, and it is those theocratic mullahs that are behind terror groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. In 1983, when much of what we see today in the Middle East was developing, I found myself on station in the Mediterranean Sea aboard the USS Coral Sea, just off the coast of Lebanon. I can't say specifically what it was I was doing there, but I can say it was in support of U.S. air power that was being exerted in support of ongoing Israeli operations against the PLO in Lebanon. It was that summer in 1983 that I first became aware of a group known as Hezbollah. They were identified as being a Lebanese terror group, but U.S. military intelligence, and certainly the CIA, was well aware of their direct ties to the mullahs in Iran. That fall, on October 23, 1983, a barracks in Beirut, Lebanon, was bombed by Hezbollah suicide bombers driving a truck, killing 241 U.S. service members. Among the dead, 220 Marines, 16 sailors, and 3 soldiers. Even today, it is difficult to bear the loss of friends and fellow warriors. Then, in the summer of 1985, this time in support of naval air operations conducted from the USS Constellation on station in the Indian Ocean, I was confronted with Hezbollah once again when they brazenly hijacked TWA Flight 847 out of Athens, Greece. In horror, I watched live on the Armed Forces Network as the limp dead body of Robert Stephan, a young Navy diver, dropped onto the tarmac from the bottom of the hijacked aircraft as it sat idle at Beirut International Airport. Robert had been brutally beaten and shot in the head. Once again, Hezbollah had taken a brother. Robert will never be forgotten by this old sailor. Fast forward over 35 years, and groups like Hezbollah still stand in the way of Middle East peace. Fast forward 35 years, and my anger towards these groups and my grief for the fallen is just as strong as it was over 3 decades ago. In many ways, I've never really overcome these events, or others like them that were part and parcel to my military service. To be honest, I used my anger and grief as excuses to wallow in self-pity and self-loathing. Powerful emotions are anger and grief. Together, they make for a potent and extremely dangerous emotional cocktail that can drive a man to do heinous, insane things in the name of justice, but which are really nothing more than hopeless and vain attempts at revenge. My hope today is merely to help people understand the truth about what stands in the way of Middle East peace and how some of the decades-old and in some cases centuries-old roadblocks that have stood in the way may now be quickly eroding. Beside the long-standing issue of Palestinian liberation and the so-called occupied territories is another issue of at least equal, if not greater significance than the fate of Palestine. It concerns the fate of the Haram al-Sharif, or Temple Mount, in Jerusalem. This mountainous area in Jerusalem, near the old city of David, is one of, if not the most contested pieces of land in history. This site is where the Muslim Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque currently stand, and is traditionally believed to be the site of Herod's restored temple, which stood in the days of Jesus and would later be destroyed by the 10th Roman Legion in 70 AD. Outside of Israel's imperative to survive and exist as a sovereign state, there can be no higher, no more coveted goal for the nation of Israel as a nation than to rebuild its holy temple and reinstitute the daily sacrifice as commanded by Moses. For Zionism, this is the only goal, as it is absolutely necessary for Messiah to come. For Christians, a third Jewish temple in Jerusalem would mark, without any doubt, the advent of the end times and the soon second coming of the Christ. But all of this is completely impossible so long as the Muslim Dome of the Rock stands upon what is the traditionally accepted site of where the Holy of Holies was located within Herod's temple. No pious Muslim will ever allow a Jewish temple to be built upon the rock where it is believed Muhammad ascended to heaven riding a white stallion, let alone allow the dome to be torn down to make way for such a thing. And yet, in spite of all of this, an organization known as the Temple Institute has been working since 1987 to gather and or create not only all of the implements necessary in the service of a temple and daily sacrifice rituals, but an entirely new Levitical priesthood to conduct these rites. It is difficult to understand why such painstaking efforts would be undertaken for a mission that, for obvious geopolitical reasons, would seem at present doomed to fail. Such is the fervor and faithfulness of the Jewish people. However, at this very moment in time, several things are occurring simultaneously that are proving to have much more potential for impact upon the situation than the whole of Jewish faith. Some of you may be aware of U.S. President Donald Trump's recently announced peace plan for Israel. The plan's official title is Peace to Prosperity, but Trump himself declared it the deal of the century, as if he's Monty Hall and this is let's make a deal. What a character, this guy. Love him or hate him, the man has got some chutzpah. Nonetheless, and notwithstanding that the plan will never be accepted as is by the Palestinian Authority or Iran and Hezbollah, it has language contained within it that to the properly trained and educated eye reveals some very exciting possibilities concerning the building of a third temple. Directly to my point concerning what presently stands in the way of a Jewish temple being built upon the Haram al-Sharif, the Trump peace plan states the following, quote, "Unlike many previous powers that had ruled Jerusalem and had destroyed the holy sites of other faiths, the state of Israel is to be commended for safeguarding the religious sites of all and maintaining a religious status quo. Given this commendable record for more than half a century, as well as the extreme sensitivity regarding some of Jerusalem's holy sites, we believe that this practice should remain and that all of Jerusalem's holy sites should be subject to the same governance regimes that exist today. In particular, the status quo at the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, should continue uninterrupted. End quote. Essentially, what the Trump administration is saying, and Benjamin Netanyahu has agreed to, in principle at least, is that everything concerning the Temple Mount will stay as it is. This implies that building a Jewish temple anywhere upon the Haram al-Sharif is not part of the peace process in any way. If this is true, regardless of whether or not the plan is adopted in any form, it raises serious questions about why Netanyahu, an open Zionist, would accept such language, as it obviously betrays Zionist designs on recapturing the Holy Mount for the purpose of building a temple. This, on its surface, makes no sense. The only way this move makes any sense at all from a Zionist point of view is if the Haram al-Sharif is no longer viewed by the Zionists as a proper site for building their temple. But this would mean abandoning centuries of tradition, something that Jewish piety makes very difficult, but apparently not impossible, because this may be exactly what is happening at this very moment. For those of you not familiar with biblical prophecies concerning the rebuilding of a Jewish temple in Jerusalem during the end times, or at the end of the age, allow me to just say at this point, a Jewish temple is central to the entire prophetic play concerning the revelation of the Christ at the end of the age and the one-world theocratic system that will dominate the world with its global trade currency monopoly and universal religion prior to the Christ's prophesied second advent. Without a physical temple in Jerusalem at the end of the age, neither the Jewish Messiah or the Christ of Christianity can appear. This is readily accepted by both faiths, and therefore abandoning the mission or the hope of rebuilding the temple is simply not an option for either faith. Nor is it necessary, even in the face of the long-standing obstacles that present when Haram al-Sharif is viewed as a potential building site. The simple reason for this, and why I believe that the traditional view is being abandoned, is because another location has been identified as the real site of both Herod's and Solomon's temples. If this new information is being considered by Israeli authorities and is figured into the in-principle acceptance of the recommendation of the Trump administration's proposed plan to continue the status quo concerning Haram al-Sharif, then the world could be standing at the precipice of a prophetic and historic event. In 2014, the Temple Institute began announcing that they had completed efforts of gathering and creating the temple implements, had trained a priesthood, and had gathered all the financing and necessary construction capacities to begin building a new temple. All that is needed is an internationally accepted site upon which to build. During this series of announcements, it was stated that once ground is broken for construction, a functioning sanctuary with a priesthood actively administering the daily sacrifice could be completed within 2.5 years. What this means is that since 2014, we have been and continue to be, at any moment going forward, less than 3 years away from a functioning Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Again, all that is needed is an acceptable site that is not the Haram al-Sharif, and that site has been located. Actually, the site was identified over 30 years ago by a man named Ernest L. Martin. Martin compiled his research into a book titled The Temples That Jerusalem Forgot. Dr. Martin dedicated his life to discovering the truth about many of the holy sites scattered throughout Jerusalem and Israel. But it is his research concerning the true historical location of Herod's restored temple prior to its destruction in 70 AD that is now coming into mainstream view and consideration. Martin long ago compiled an overwhelming amount of evidence that when looked at without the blinding biases of long-cherished traditions, reveals a convincing case that points not to the Haram al-Sharif as the proper location of Herod's temple, but rather a site off the traditional so-called Temple Mount and inside the old city of David, specifically the location known as the Gihon Spring. This location, Dr. Martin argues, is where Herod's temple stood, not the location of tradition where what is referred to as the Western Wailing Wall is believed to be remnants of the last temple. In reality, and Dr. Martin proves it, the foundation stones of the structure referred to as the Wailing Wall are, in fact, the remains of the Roman Fort Antonia that existed in Herod's day and housed the 10,000 soldiers of the famous and feared Roman 10th Legion. Given that I have personal family ties to Dr. Martin dating back to the early 70s, I have long been aware of Dr. Martin's research, both in this area as well as many others. Both Dr. Martin and his research have always been very controversial and disturbing to the status quo. It was an expository of Dr. Martin's concerning Christian tithing that ultimately led to a devastating split of the worldwide Church of God in the early 1970s, a church for which my father was apparently a rather powerful deacon within the local congregation that my family attended during my childhood. I assure you, any issues with tithing were likely the least of that church's troubles at the time. I can personally attest that the Worldwide Church of God also had some issues with certain pastoral staff and their inabilities to keep their hands off the little boys and girls. But this is an issue for another time. Although Dr. Martin passed away in 2002, the organization he founded, the Associates for Scriptural Knowledge, continues under the guidance of David Seeloff. And it has been David Seeloff's belief in and dedication to Dr. Martin's work concerning where the Third Temple could and should be built that has kept the research alive and relevant. So much so that Dr. Martin's work is now gaining much broader attention and acceptance within the powerful academic and religious circles that shape the conversations concerning such matters. In earlier times, long-standing traditions were only abandoned after years of conflict, struggle, and resistance. But here in the information age, the speed of change and destruction of the old has accelerated exponentially. Could it be that the stage is set for a Jewish and Christian break from tradition that will lead to the building of a third Jewish temple? Will nations like Iran and groups like Hezbollah abandon their goal of totally destroying Israel and seek peace? Will the great Satan finally be destroyed, or at least kicked out of the Middle East? Does the Trump Peace to Prosperity plan pave the way for any of this? At this point, no one can really know. However, an interesting aside concerning the Trump proposal is this. Yes, it was expected that Israel would agree to this plan. Yes, it was expected that the Palestinian Authority and Hezbollah would reject it immediately. Actually, the Palestinian Authority rejected it before it was even announced. What was not readily expected was the countries of Oman, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt all offering tacit acceptance of the deal. Geopolitical issues concerning land prevent countries like Jordan and Lebanon from accepting the deal as is at this point. However, this broader acceptance of the deal among a large number of Arab Islamic coalition countries should not and cannot be overlooked. Yes, it will be hard as hell to convince Iran to make peace with Israel. The great Satan leaving the Middle East would go a long way in aiding that effort, and I believe the Trump administration is taking steps in that direction. But what would go even further in pushing Iran towards peace with Israel would be several of its neighbors in the region, including the ones tolerant of the Shiite sect of Islam, for which Iran's majority is Shiite, to form a new Middle Eastern bloc of countries in which the majority favors peace with Israel and a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Something along this very line is believed by many to be put forth by biblical prophecies. And there is no doubt that the geopolitical landscape is shifting in a direction where such things could come about very quickly in the region. Acceptance of the Trump peace plan by the previously mentioned countries is evidence of such. However, is Donald Trump the world leader that will broker peace between Israel and its present enemies? Not according to the prophet Daniel, if biblical prophecy is your guide. And if it is, then I would suggest that you keep your eyes on the country of Iraq, specifically the region of Nineveh. This is where the peacemaker of the end times will hail from. Until next time, this is Raven signing off.